Thank you all for coming to this event. Welcome Jericho Brown, who's coming all the way from Atlanta.
All right, Jericho Brown.
Winner of a Guggenheim, a Whiting, Pulitzer Prize, probably NEA, probably more than that.
I just applied.
You apply. We can talk about it.
Yeah.
Right now we're gonna just have a discussion with him, and I might open things up by asking him some general questions. But I'd love for everybody to just jump in when you have questions. Before we get started, I'll say tonight the important thing is Jericho's reading tonight at the South Bend Public Library. It's going to be a great reading. It's also really an important event because it's part of our Kelly Writer series, which is about Notre Dame engaging with the wider community of South Bend. So it's a really important event in that regard as well.
And supporting the library for the amazing work librarians do and the people who go there. We want to be part of their show of strength and show of force. So that's where you come in.
Yeah. South Bend Library, if you didn't know, is amazing. It's like a real hub and center of the South Bend community. People go there after school, after work, before school. It's always stuff happening there. So we want to support them the best way we can, and we decided that bring Jericho to read would be the best way.
So here we go.
Yeah. But now we're going to talk to Jericho about whatever you feel like talking about. But maybe we could begin by one of these kind of easy questions, which is maybe you can just talk a little bit about how you came to poetry and something like that.
If I can remember that far back. I came to poetry probably, I loved it. I haven't met a microphone I don't like. I came to poetry really just because, in two ways. Way number one is the fact that, well, maybe three ways. I just sort of got lucky. I was born in a year where by the time I was going to certain school in certain grades, I was learning poetry in school because poetry hadn't been taken out of school. So I learned poetry the same way. I used to be able to say the same way everybody learns poetry. You get it in, you go to school. You grow up, you go to elementary school, and there's, Tiger Burning Bright. Do you understand what I mean? There was a great deal of William Blake early on, and then later other poets, including Plath, Sexton, and Lowell. Junior year of high school is a year that you do the research paper. It takes you what they call the research paper year in English. It takes you a year to write a research paper, because we learned to write a research paper in my junior year in high school step by step. Using the library, which means there was a time you turned in the note cards. Do you all remember this?
I remember
that you turned. This probably doesn't happen anymore, and it seems very foreign. But we were learning research and learning how to use the library. And I missed school one day, and the next day I came to school. They had a day that they picked topics. And the next day when I came to school, there was one topic left on a list of topics, and I'll never forget the font of it. And I'll never forget what it looked like. It said the Confessional Poets. It was at the bottom of this list. No one picked it. It said the Confessional Poets, Plath, Lowell, Sexton. And I was actually really happy because I was already reading Plath, Lowell, and Sexton, and that gets to the second way. And the second way is when I was a very young kid, my mom, who is an improvisational genius, she couldn't afford childcare. And so she figured out that when she could not be with us, by us I mean me and my sister, she would take us to the library. And I used to say they didn't know it, but now I do believe that they knew it. They were our babysitters. In some, it's the 21st century now, things are a lot different. It probably seems that maybe my mother was a bad mother and neglectful, but she was not, because we were afraid of our mother. So we weren't gonna tear up the library. You wouldn't be able to do this with your kids, because your kids would tear up the library because y'all don't beat your kids to death. And if you beat your kids, then you wouldn't have to worry about them tearing up the library. So the advice here is beat your kids. Anyway, then you can leave them at the library. The wonderful thing about it too was that there was no such thing as the internet at the time. So I had no choice, because I was in the library, I had no choice but to read books. If there had been an internet, I probably wouldn't have read books. And I also, to this day, I have a hard time with prose. And so wandering the stacks, I found poetry, and I felt like I was cheating because I would come across these books that were sometimes only 1/4 of the page full of text. Do you see what I mean? But I would read, so I had no idea what a poem said or meant. I would read the poem and I'd be so excited. You know, you're like 7 or 8 years old. You're like, I'm done with that. And I read another, I'm like, oh, I read that. And you're turning pages. And I remember one time, I got in the car with my mom after being at the library. She picked us up, me and my sister. We could also walk home. Sometimes she would pick us up after work. She would just come to the library to pick us up. But the library, the Morningside branch of the Shreveport Public Library, was on the way home on our walk from school. Also something you can't do anymore. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it used to be you would walk home to school with your little, when I was 8 years old, I was holding my 5-year-old sister's hand, walking home from school. You don't do that anymore. Anyway, so we would go to the library and we would, my sister was like a library genius. Like, she figured out microfiche and magazines, and she would be listening to albums. I'm like, I don't know how you made this happen. But it got to a point that I would get to the library, and Laura McKinney, who was the librarian sort of working at the time when we would get there, she would have stacks of poetry books waiting for me because she knew it makes me kind of emotional,
Yeah, let's have it, yeah.
Because she was, I don't know, what librarians like, y'all know how librarians, they're just the best people on the planet, man.
Yes.
Angels, right?
Yes.
So she would have these stacks of poetry books waiting for me. I would come in. I remember I would be in like the 5th grade, like 10 years old, coming into the library, and I'd be like, how like when you're 10, you just run everywhere, you know what I mean? Running up to the thing, she'd have this stack of poetry books waiting for me, and I'd pick up the stack of books, not really even thanking her now that I think about it. Do you know what I'm saying? And I would but she knew it would sort of keep me still for long periods of time because my goal was always to get through the book, because if I got through a book, I could tell my mom I read a book in the library today. But I wouldn't tell my mom they were books of poetry because books of poetry were shorter and I felt like I was cheating. And I liked the way my mom looked when I said, I had read a book. And I had no idea what these books were saying. I'm also really lucky because Laura McKinney was not a poetry reader. Mm-hmm. So she gave me books by poets because she had heard of them. Mm-hmm. She imagined the content of these books to be more like Hallmark cards. Laura Bush was this way. You remember when Laura Bush invited the poets to the White House to read during the Iraq War, and all the poets got there and they read their anti-war poems, and she was she was scandalized, like, what the hell is happening? I just wanted to have a good time here. You know what I mean? Because people have, their ideas about what poetry is, which is often not what poetry is. So Laura McKinney was very early on giving me, like, when I was like 10 years old, giving me books by the poets she had heard of, which ultimately just meant the poets who were either taught in school or poets who had won the Pulitzer Prize, because that's how you hear poets exist, if you're not a reader. And so I was reading Anne Sexton when I was 7, 8, 9, and 10 years old. No idea what Anne Sexton was saying, but also, I think it was just the best thing that could ever happen to me. It also was kind of weird because maybe don't give you the depressed 10-year-old Anne Sexton. And I was reading Plath, I was reading Lowell, I read, at that time, because she had heard of them, I was reading Robert Pinsky, Rita Dove, obviously Langston Hughes and Gwendolyn Brooks and Nikki Giovanni, a lot of that, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, a lot of that happened very early for me. And then, and that sort of, when you read something and it turns you on, or hear something and it turns you on, you sort of automatically try to do it. Yeah. So you don't have to be able to sing. If you hear a song, this has happened to everybody in this room. There's a song you love, it comes on the radio, you sing it. Do y'all know what I mean? Yeah. The fact that you can't sing has nothing to do with your impulse to sing it. And I think similarly, I would read these poems and I would want to make poems, and I would make, what were probably very bad poems, and my mom would put them on the refrigerator. And then the third way is just through church. I went. I was a part of that institution known as the Black Church as a kid growing up. No choice of my own. And at that time, and I think maybe in many ways this is still the case, the church was very involved. The Black Church was very involved not only with its religion, with Christ, but also was involved with ultimately civil rights. I'm early enough to have been a part of that before all the churches, when churches were places for politics. And so just like you could see, also I grew up at a time, I'm sorry the answer to this is so long. I'm just trying to give it fully. I'm a professor, so it takes me a long time to answer a damn question. I guess y'all are used to that. But when I was young, I grew up at a time, and I think maybe this has something to do with being Black too, but children weren't really allowed to be shy. If you grow up in a Black church, there is every month some sort of a program or pageant or event that you're practicing for as a kid. So when it's Easter, I think we just had Easter, right? When it's Easter, you give your Easter speech. The fact that you don't want to give an Easter speech has nothing to do with you giving an Easter speech. And so as soon as you have speech, which is 2 or 3 years old, you get an Easter speech. And your Easter speech, if you're very, very, very young, might be as simple as, "Happy Easter, everybody." Which, if you said that and you were a 2 or 3 year old in a brand new dress and that was your Easter speech, the entire church would act as if you had made a touchdown. So you can imagine what would happen if you recite the 23rd Psalm. And there was occasion such that when we were very young people, we would write along with recitations from the Bible, scriptures from the Bible. We would also be asked to, you could see a 12-year-old reciting "Still I Rise" or "Phenomenal Woman" by Maya Angelou, or a 10-year-old reciting "Ego Tripping" by Nikki Giovanni, or a 15-year-old reciting "The Negro Speaks of Rivers, I Was Born." Do you know what I'm saying? By Langston Hughes, or "I Too" by Langston Hughes, or "Mother to Son." There was a lot of Langston Hughes in the church when I was growing up. And that's how I came to poetry. And it turned me on, man. I thought it was the best because I understood, well, first of all, to be quite honest with you, because it was short. And I love that still to this day about poems, that you can hold them in your head, that there's a way you read a poem, and then later that same day you're looking at the avocados, but you're still dealing with that poem. You're like mowing the lawn, but you're still dealing with that poem. And I was attracted to them because of that, but also really because of the fact of line. And there always seemed to me some meaning to the fact that I read, and then even if the sentence is still going, I have to, something happens in that blank space. And even as a kid, I was really, really fascinated by what must be going on between the lines. So that's how I came to it, and that's why I got into it. So I was always, I don't remember not trying to write poems. Yeah. Does that answer you?
Yeah, great.
Hell yeah.
I love it.
Oh, wow, I get clapped for an answer. Now, I like South Bend. I like Notre Dame, baby. They clap when you answer a question. I ain't even read a poem. That's what's up.
I love what you say about the line break, because when I read your poems, often stuff happens in the line break.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking on 4 day in the morning, I thank God for my citizenship in spite, line break, of the timer set on my life to write, line break, these words. I love my mother. And the colon after these words almost seems like a line break too. I don't know, maybe, do you want to talk a little bit more about line breaks? I'm interested in, it seems like they may kind of make cuts in the poems, but it also propels it into new directions. It seems like you really love having a line break and then having it be surprising. This is a space where it takes a new direction.
Yeah, I actually probably have a lot to say about line and line break. So much to say that it gets on my students' nerves. And I think, I'm wondering I'll keep, I think having a personal poetics and adhering to it in as much as you are also able to expand and change it is very important. That at least has been important to me. What I think poetry is at this age, or what I think poetry can do, or what I think poetry can be or look like, is very different from what it was, 40 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, and it should always be changing. So far, though, I still have a lot of respect for the fact of the line, a good deal of respect for meter, which is often out of fashion, a good deal of I'm interested. I just have intellectual and artistic interests in that. When I was in graduate school, back before I owned a laptop, you had these computers. I mean, you had they were sort of fancy if you had one that stood up as opposed to one that laid down. Do y'all know what I mean? You had like this vertical box, and I remember over the desk in my room where I lived at the time, I had this banner that I had printed, and it said "Every line a surprise," to sort of remind me that when I feel I have come to an end of the line, my job is to say something other than what I automatically want to say, to very quickly rethink where that line was going and make mine. This became my habit. Make the next line must in some way be far away from, whether it's because of subversion, maybe I'm subverting what the line says, maybe it's because of negation, maybe it's because of a leap, like I'd simply start talking about something else. But that line to line, that even I as a writer should not know. I should be surprised. I should be like, wait, I'm saying that? What? I'm saying that now? Oh, I'm saying that. Why am I? Then if you practice this enough, you end up saying, you get to the point where your writing is that which you did not expect to say. And if you are saying what you did not expect to say, you are writing a poem.
That's right.
Right? If you're saying what you expected to say, you're still trying to get to the point of where your poem is, which is why often when we write, we have to cut a third of the top, or what? Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. A third of the poem at the top, and then for others of us, maybe a third at the bottom, because we're only repeating. We're only repeating what we've said at some point, and that means it's over, and you can't surprise yourself anymore, which is good because you have enough at the top to be a poem. So I got. In fact, there's this by James Loggenbach. There's this essay online in Line Break where he talks about the difference between an annotated and a sparse line. And I was very attracted to that essay as a young person, thinking about the way, Sylvia Plath's Edge, for instance, I remember this I know for a fact that Edge was the first poem I ever read in my life that breaks the modifier from the noun. And I remember seeing something like her dead line break body. And I remember, and I was a kid, and when I say kid, I mean I was like 9 or 10 years old. And I remember reading that and being like, girl, what?
Yeah.
Like, what am I supposed to do? And all the rupture that was created in that break, I felt inside my body, you know what I mean? And so I'm thinking about this all the time, about ways to handle stuff such that the line appears as its own poetry. This happens in very short poems. A poem like In a Station of the Metro by Ezra Pound. Each of those lines is a line, if that makes any sense, that you sort of take and can do its own thing. And in many poems, and so it's sort of impossible in the whole of a poem. But my goal when I'm writing is such that you sort of close your eyes and pick a line in any poem, and that line in and of itself can do work. Because I really do believe in the line as a unit of poems. If the line is indeed a unit of poetry, you should be able to take several disparate lines and put them together for some reason, maybe because they're all iambic pentameter, or maybe because they all mention your mother, or maybe because they're all 9 to 11 syllables long. If you were to do that, if you take some conglomeration of lines and put them together, then you should be able to build from that a great poem. Because each of the lines, you would never put together the bad lines. You would take your best lines and put them together, which is now really, particularly in the tradition, how a lot of my poems were written, definitely the duplexes. The duplexes are all made from lines that existed. Somebody said a line earlier that I wrote down. And then, who said that? Somebody sitting in front of me. Was it you that said it, or was it you that said it? Somebody said, well, you said, I cannot wait for you to make up your baked item mind. I like that. Where did I put the coffee line? It should be right under there. I don't know where I put it. What did you say about, oh, it's never too soon to get coffee, right? So if you can come up with something that seems voiced or particular, it's not necessarily, I mean, it's actually better if it is simply colloquial. Do you know what I mean? And if you set that, this is how you end up with a phrase like, I love my mother in a poem, because you would never say that in a poem. Do you see what, like, yeah, you would never say that. But if you write down I love my mother and you just like let it sit in the notes app of your iPhone for, 10 to 20 years, sooner or later, there's reason to make use of it. Or if you decide, as I did, every line that I've ever written that's not in a poem that's more than 5 beats, I'm going to take all of those lines, literally every one of them, and I'm going to put them in a Microsoft Word document if they say something about my mom. And then when I do that, I end up with like ultimately pages and pages of very long lines about my mother. Well, if I have, and some of those lines are from 2010, some of them are from 1999, and some of them are from 2018. And if I take all, or other years, if I take all those lines and I start moving them around, I didn't have to sit down and write a poem from top to bottom. I had to find my poem in the lines. This is the way, and that's ultimately how I write poems, to be quite honest with you. The duplexes were written because I decide on a line is the strangest line, or the most attractive, or the most unique. And then I find another line and I make couplets that are poems. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough, is a couplet that is a poem. Any couplet in a hustle, I think, should also be a poem. Do y'all understand what I mean?
Yeah.
The only reason that the leaping that happens in each couplet, I mean, it is not this way in the contemporary hustle, obviously, right? You read a poem, a hustle called, there's a hustle, for instance, I'm thinking of Natasha Trethewey because she's in a picture on the wall there. She has a hustle called Miscegenation, which is very in the style of Natasha Trethewey, very narrative, right? But the hustle originally is a form that's ultimately the most, for it to be something like 6th century AD. Do you know what I mean? So as a form, it's fascinating to me that the requirement of the hustle is that each couplet have nothing to do with one another other than the repeated rhyme and the repeated word at the end. So it's literally bound together by sound. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
And so you're leaping. But yes. So the only way you leap from one couplet to another is by sound. But if I'm going to be reading a poem, that means every couplet's got to do poetry work. So that's sort of the goal of the duplex. I was making couplets, and then I put the couplets together. If you put 7 couplets together, you got yourself a sonnet, baby. Do you understand what I mean? So that's sort of, to answer your question about line, that's the importance of line. You keep up. I just keep up every time I hear something that might be of use. I don't know. I don't care that I use it right then. We have this, when I was younger, I should say, and I feel this with my students, they have this idea, they have a line or 2 or 3, you're lucky if you got 3. You type 3 lines and then you push until you make a poem. But in actuality, your poem is somewhere sitting in your notebooks. if you put together things, if you fragment and juxtapose and pastiche enough and think of, this part that worked in this poem that failed, there's no such thing as a failure. If you're a poet and you write a poem and the poem doesn't work out, there's at least one line in there that's good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Usually two. And they're usually the two at the top. Do you the thing that got you started?
Yeah.
And I think I have a different way of pushing, because if I write 2 lines, I don't wait to know what I'm going to say next. I think my students type 2 lines and they start looking at the ceiling because that's where God is, and He'll send down, the next line. I type 2 lines and I'm immediately going to write something else based on the sound of those lines, not based on their content. Who cares what a line of poetry says while you're writing the poem? It's not until revision that I get concerned with that. With what things say, like, who cares? Do you know what I mean? That takes all the fun out of it. If you're worried about what it says, girl, you'll never have a good time. You know what I'm saying? I want to have a good time, and it's more fun for me to be saying things that have to do with sound and enjoying myself, such that when I have whatever I have, at the end of that, I have a page full of something, and then I can ask that thing questions. Who is your speaker? There's sand right here. There's sand right here. Where are you? A beach? A desert? Do you see what I mean? And so that's how I end up pushing the poems beyond the mess of text that I make originally. I think it's good to make a mess of text, and from that mess, you can sort of hue your poem. Does that make sense?
Of course it makes sense.
Yeah.
All right.
Now you know how
I
to
think
revise.
it's time for one of these students to sing for their suppers. Questions?
Sing for their suppers.
Yeah, let's have a question.
Are there questions?
I know what the question is.
Oh, here's a
Let's
question
ask
right
a
here.
question.
Hi.
Hi. There's a poet, and when they won something, they said, "We are each other. I mean that quite literally." And I've never forgotten that, and I think it's true. And I'm wondering what you have to say on that thoughts. We are each other.
Who said that?
Last name Gay.
Ross Gay.
Yes.
Yeah, girl, I love Ross Gay. I'm not going to disagree with Ross Gay about nothing. Yeah, and not in Indiana. Amen. Bless God. Bless His holy name.
Yeah.
No, yeah, Ross Gay, yeah. If Ross Gay said it, it's true, sure. Wow, you like Ross Gay?
Yes.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to tell him you said that. What's your name?
Emiliano Gomez.
Oh, that's a great name, Emiliano. What's up? I'm going to tell him you said that. I'll send him an email. Then he'll check a month later. Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't mean to be any type of way in the answering of this question. Sometimes I can start to sound very new agey, and I apologize in advance for that. I do particularly because I'm a teacher, and being a teacher of writing, I think it's a good idea to stay on the ground as much as possible. But pedagogy itself is theory. You know what I mean? So I will say, given that fact, I don't know if that's really questionable. I mean, I imagine that might be a question, right? I think some people would probably think oh, that's weird, or oh, that doesn't make sense, or oh, that's not true, but I don't know if I can expound on it anymore because it seems to me kind of obvious. You know what I mean?
Yes.
That's fine.
Yes.
How do you go from playtime of writing to putting a book together?
You keep making it playtime, that's for sure. And you gotta love this, and you should always be making ways to love it. And sometimes making ways to love it means doing it differently. And we were talking about this a little bit last night over dinner about how this poet, Brian Tier, one of his books, he literally wrote while walking. Thank God he didn't get run over. Do you know what I mean? But he needed to do that in order to try something new that would keep him alive as a poet. I think it's and different people have different ways that they do things. The number one thing that I think is very important in putting the book together is not to allow any contemporary idea of what poetry is to be the guiding force for your book. you need to be the most contemporary thing about your book. And if that means your book is doing some sort of weird, crazy thing in the putting together, that's great, that's wonderful. Be as avant-garde as you possibly can forever, because everybody you ever read in a book is. Do you know what I mean? Like when you read an anthology, the reason people get anthologized is because they're doing something original or new or different for their time. Do you understand what I mean? So do that, and yet I would not ever say that there is anything wrong with chronology. So I think the first thing that's most important to me when I'm putting together a book is knowing the order in which things happen in the poems that I'm dealing with. If everybody here definitely doesn't have this, so you wouldn't be able to think of this in the same way, but if you don't have it in terms of a speaker, I'm thinking of, in my books, I'm thinking, oh, well, this speaker is 5, so I guess it's early in the book. And this speaker is 55, so I guess that's how you know the speaker ain't me. Anyway, this speaker is 55, so I guess it's later in the book. Do y'all understand what I mean? Like, I think if you put the poems in order that way, then that can become, I don't think you should keep it that way. I wouldn't keep it that way, but maybe you will keep it that way. But that becomes at least a guide on the ground for like what you're dealing with in terms of what a reader will experience if they experience the book as a life. Does that make sense? And that will help you also understand, I think, what your subjects or themes are in the book when you put them in a certain kind of absolute chronology. And then there will be poems that sit outside of that chronology that become like a certain kind of a guide. The other thing that, you don't have to keep it in chronology, but knowing that I think will help you understand how to put your book together. The other thing that I've always done that I think is very useful is that I put the poems together. So that's one set. That's one printed. Also, print things is a good idea. I have to tell my students this, they've never printed a thing in their lives, and they think printing is like the weirdest, strangest, and though they have the experience, they'll bring a poem to class, and y'all know one way to see what's wrong with your poem is to print it. And as soon as they print it, they make copies and they bring, y'all probably don't do this anymore, but we do it because I think it helps them write. As soon as they print it, they see everything wrong with their poem. But you couldn't see that on the screen for some reason. Do y'all understand what I mean? As soon as you're holding it in your hand, you're like, what was I thinking? You either print it or you email it to a friend. You email a poem to a friend, I promise, as soon as you email it to your friend, you will have 9 other versions you email in 9 minutes right after. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like the idea of someone else seeing the poem or holding the poem changes what you can see in a single poem. So similarly with a book, I would print out the chronology and then I would print another copy in which you make piles given themes. I think the chronology can help you see the themes that jump out, and then the themes jump out and you make piles like, here are all my poems about race. Here are all my poems about immigration. Here are all my poems about domestic life with my man. Do you understand what I'm saying? And you have those things, and then it's just good to know how many of them you have in every area. And then after that, the thing I do that is probably just the Jericho Brown thing is, I know those 2 things, and once I know those 2 things, I make decisions based on last line to title. This might not be true, I don't know, but the reason I do that, and they're usually associative, maybe not direct, maybe not narrative, but the reason I do that is because then, as a reader, the reader will read a last line, hopefully, of a good poem. And when they read that last line and their eye goes to the next page, they automatically think, well, I gotta keep going. Because obviously something about that title means that it is connected to this last line. And my goal or my hope or my intention is that that pushes the reader through the book in a way that we think about reading something like any other piece of prose, like a novel or a piece of nonfiction. I should probably show you what I mean. Hold on. So here's a book. Yeah, this is good. So this is a poem called Homeland. The last line or last lines of that poem is, every day something gets thrown away on account of long history or hair or fingernails or, yes, of course, my fangs. The title of the next poem is Host. It's just because I have the word fangs. That's the only real reason why. The last lines of that poem are, we can host, but we won't meet without a recent pic and a real name and the sound of your deepest voice. Then the sound of your deepest voice is followed by a poem titled Football Season. The last lines of that poem are, this is a long sentence, but I'll read the last sentence. I can drink a few more, see the Patriots or the Cowboys or another very long war right here on this stool, watching my money work for me, the heat up and me comfortable enough to complain about it. And then the title of the next poem is The Rest We Deserve. Do you see what I mean? And so that way you end up knowing what your themes are and knowing what your chronology is, but then you don't necessarily end up with a book that's only thematic or only chronological. You end up with a book that's poetry, that's making certain kinds of leaps and juxtapositions that you associate with poetry, and asides that you associate with poetry. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Great.
Hi.
Hi. You already touched a little on your process of writing duplexes, but I was wondering if you could talk more about the creation of the form itself.
Yeah, I can. I first should probably say, to answer this question, that I never, and I don't, I don't know. I'm a poetry nerd, but who isn't? Like, who here is not a, do you know what I'm saying? Like, but there are levels of poetry nerdism. And so I'll say, and I do feel this way, when contemporary poets invent a form, I will get the book and I'll read the book and I'll realize, oh, here I am at this form they invented. And I generally roll my eyes. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I remember when Terrence Hayes had this book with all these golden shovels in it, and I remember reading the golden shovel and being like, okay, girl. Like, you know what I mean? Like, oh, look who's got time on his hands. Do you know what I mean? And, I always feel like my poetry nerd is, poetry nerd enough for me to be a college professor, but not poetry nerd enough to be inventing a form. Like, who cares? Who's got the time? Like, I'd rather be making love. Do you know what I'm saying? I would. So I didn't set out to invent a form. I was thinking about poetry as I'm always thinking about poetry, and I was thinking about, I think there are two things that happened at the same time. Maybe one is that I was thinking, I wonder if it's possible for me to write a poem that is completely repetition. How would you do that? Then I came across, thinking about that, I came across two things. One is this book, I think it's by Joy Harjo, interestingly enough, because she's not a poet I read all the time, but she has this, she's amazing, Joy is. But she has this poem, I think it's called She Had Horses or something, a girl had, and the poem is actually that, like it repeats that over and over again in a way that turns out to be sort of, ultimately a variety of that same line, changed over and over again, variations of that line. And then I was also there are little things, I'll hold them and make much of them. There's this epigraph to a Nikki Finney book by A.J. Verdale, a writer I have a great deal of, a fiction writer I have a great deal of respect for. And her, the epigraph is, repetition is holy, which I think is true. I think we know that from songs. I think we know that from chanting. I think we know that from prayer. Like something about repetition does a thing. Even in action, there's a way that doing the same thing over and over begins to feel like religion, if that makes sense, or the sense that it makes to do something over and over in your life begins to feel holy or sacred, right? So I wanted to make a poem that was pure repetition, and I didn't understand how that was possible, and I was thinking about that for about 10 years, to be quite honest with you. And then I fell in love with the hustle, so much so that I wrote a bunch of whole hustles that were bad, and I included one in my second book.
That one's good.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I have always loved the blues. As a music form, I always feel like the blues is really the first poetry I ever got, because I got it in music and fell in love with it and was really taken by it. And because I got it in music, it's one of the forms that when I was learning forms in school, I already understood it, you know. And then there's the sonnet, which I think we all have a love-hate relationship with. The love part of that relationship, I guess, I hope is obvious because of the work any sonnet can do on your life. But the hate part of it just has to do with the fact that of the pervasiveness of it. You know, poets always want to be doing that which is new and different. And yet here I am dealing in this thing where, you know, when I sit on a plane and somebody asks me what I do for a living, I say I'm a poet, and then they say, oh, sonnets? You know, and they don't remember the last time they've read a poem, but they know what the hell a sonnet is, which makes me angry. It doesn't burn you up. I mean, they don't call it the Elizabethan sonnet for nothing. It is imperial. Do you know what I'm saying? Culturally, I think. So I was just thinking about these forms that I've always been very interested in, and I was thinking of ways that I would take that interest to be, how do I create a poem? How do I make manifested that interest coming forth from me, a person who feels, I shouldn't say who feels, but who is often called to the mat about identity. You know, I meet people and they want me to be 66% black and 20% queer and 2% Southern and 7% my mama's son. Do you know what I mean? I'm like, I can't do math well enough to keep up. I think I'm 100% all those things at the same time. Like, I'm in 1,000%. Do you know what I mean? So I really... so that's the thinking behind the duplex. How do I make something that is as much a mutt as I feel in the world? How do I make something that is at once definitely a sonnet, at once definitely a blues poem, at once definitely a hustle? And so that's how it came to be in terms of the thinking about it. And then the 9 to 11 syllable count has to do with marrying East and West. You know, Western forms are often based in meter, iambic pentameter being one of the most popular meters, although my usual line, even in a free verse poem, is usually more like tetrameter. And then more just natural to myself. And then Eastern forms are often based in either the look of the length of the line, which is also fascinating about the hustle itself, right? That the hustle is like, stop, because that looks about as long as the one above it, you know, which is interesting to me in 600 AD. Do you know what I'm saying? Anyway, or about syllabics. And so 9 to 11 syllables has to do with syllabics that also approximate iambic pentameter. So that's the thinking about it before I did it. And then the poems themselves sort of filled. I wouldn't do this now. I mean, now when I write a duplex, I can generally write them from top to bottom, but I think it's just because I've had a lot of practice. But all the duplexes that are in my last book, The Tradition, all of those duplexes were built by lines from years. I mean, I was thinking we should actually do it here, but I don't know if we'll have time or if there's space, but I would love to do a duplex writing workshop. I do them all the time. I've done them with my students at Emory, and you always yield something you can use. But if you take a conglomeration of lines that are 9 to 11 syllables long, written over the course of your life that haven't been used in a poem or that can come out of a poem that's failing, if you take all those lines and you decide, I'm going to make couplets that are poems, and some of those couplets are going to have the exact same line, right? Obviously, the second line of every couplet in the duplex repeats, right? So that second line becomes a first line, then that second line becomes a first line. And if you can do that over and over again, then you can end up with a duplex. And so that's how they were built. Does that make sense? And I think built, also, you know, I was telling this to my students, like, it's good to have other words. It's good to have words other than right. And sometimes just changing a word in your thinking about the way you're making. The word make is of use, possibly, if you're a cook. Do you understand what I mean? But definitely, a word like build has been of great use to me in the making of my poems. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank
Okay.
you.
I have a question.
Yes, Joyelle. And then I'll do right there.
Yeah. Okay, so I teach Intro to Creative Writing, and during our poetry unit, like, every day I find myself saying, like, the work of poetry is transformation, and like the next day I'll be like, the work of poetry is like something else. So, and it's fun to kind of like keep redefining like what it is. So I was curious, like, if you were to finish that sentence, like, the work of poetry is blank, how would you finish that?
We got you on the ropes now.
Yeah,
Jericho
this is
Brown.
hard,
Yeah,
right?
thank
You know, I don't know. I mean, because but I can't get it wrong. It just makes it harder. The questions you can't get wrong make the answer harder. I hadn't thought about this. Can I tell you something that I think is a good idea? And then by the end of me telling you, maybe I'll have an answer to this question. One of the things that I do when I'm teaching intro, definitely when I started, the first time I taught intro, I was a graduate student, as I imagine you are. And I remember very distinctly every class, I would make them fill in the blank. I was like, poetry is, and they would have to fill in that blank. And usually I would have some pervading metaphor that they would be making use of that they chose very early in the semester. Something that came from something that they love to do that is not poetry, whether that's skateboarding or music. And so then they would have to say poetry is or poetry is like, and then use something from that metaphor in order to fill in that sentence, which over the course of the semester meant that they would have every week 15 different ways of thinking about what poetry, and just thinking about poetry given the other thing that you do or another thing you're obsessed with, thinking about it that way is very helpful to you writing it. Now what am I supposed to do now?
Yeah, I guess if you
What's the beginning of it?
the work of poetry.
Oh, yes, I've been thinking, maybe it's obvious that I think about this. So the work of poetry is, I think the work of poetry is recognition of the self. Like, that the work of, like, poetry leads us to who we really are. It shows us over and over again what we're actually doing, what we're actually participating in, and the reasons why, in a way that, you know, you could be doing or participating in something for a very long time, but because poetry names it, you then have to deal with who you really are. And there's a way that there are certain actions in this world that you can take and take them without understanding that doing those actions enough leads to an identity. Does that answer you? Yeah.
So, what advice would you give to a graduating senior who wants to stick with creative writing but isn't necessarily doing it as a profession?
I don't know if they, I don't, hey, when somebody asks me what I'm doing for a living, I could say I'm a college professor and they would continue to be nice to me. I say I'm a poet so they leave me alone. So I don't really think, do you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm a poet by identity. I don't think I do poetry for a living. I do, but really, no. Do you understand what I do poetry for a living, as in, if I didn't write it, I would die. Do you know? I would be unhappy. When I'm not writing, I'm generally, like, my friends don't like me. Do you know? They're like, oh God, please go write a fucking poem. You know what I mean? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So my advice to you would be the same advice that I would give anybody going into an MFA program. I think it's a good idea to be reading with a certain level of intention, and if you're reading poetry with a certain level of intention, then you have no choice but to write it. And so that means you create a schedule for reading. And when I was in graduate school, I was reading a book a day. It's the best time of my life. Do you know, like literally I would go to the university library and turn in a book, pick up a book, read the book. The next day I would turn in that book, pick up a book, read a book. And books of poetry are short, so why not? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's good to have something you're reading all the time. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that in a second. But it's also a good idea, so to be reading is a good idea. And to be reading on a schedule, because maybe it's not a book a day, so maybe you can decide a number of pages. Maybe you can decide whether I'm in school for it or not, I read 10 pages of poetry a day. Even if I gotta search the internet for those 10 pages. But I wouldn't search the internet, I would get a book, making it easier for you to read 10 pages by a single author. Also, I think anthologies are of use. They don't really make them like they used to. They used to make anthologies of contemporary poetry, and then they got away from that because people got mad about them. People got mad for good reason, but then now there aren't any anthologies. Do y'all know what I mean? I miss it. Y'all don't miss it. Y'all probably hated anthologies. These are probably the people who were like, ooh, anthologies. But I loved anthologies because if you read an anthology, you figure out who you like.
Right.
And if you could, because there are 3 to 5 poems by someone. And you read those 3 to 5 poems and you think, oh my God, they can't write. Then you go to the next person. You didn't lose your life. Do you know what I mean? And then sooner or later you come across somebody and you're like, oh my God, these are great poems. Then you go read their books.
That's the key.
And then when you go read their books, you gotta like, like if you like a poet like, let's say, Louise Glick, or Carl Phillips, then you've got like 13 books to read.
Yeah.
And it's already set for you, and you can decide what you want to do. What I would do is I would get an anthology of contemporary American poetry, and I would read all of the women of color in the anthology first.
Okay.
And so when I was done with those two, which was the problem with anthologies, right? Well, one of the problems, because there was also an aesthetic problem, I think. There was, then I would read all of the men of color, and then when I finished those two, I would then read the rest of the women. And then when I was finished with those two, but you know what I'm saying? Like, and then, you know what I mean? But reading the anthology would lead me to books. Then I would read all of the books by that particular person. I would not. The other thing you can do is go to your independent. This is what I used to do as an undergrad, even. And definitely in graduate school, because I felt I was a person who could not afford books. I spent a lot of time in libraries. It's harder to do this in libraries because they don't put all the damn poems together. But in a bookstore, they put all the poems together, and there's one shelf, so it's not hard. You go and you start at A. If you start at A, you're gonna be like, this is boring, and you put it back. And I literally mean a few lines. You read read a few lines of the first poem. If you don't feel like going on in that poem, put it back. It's not for school. You don't have to read the first poem. And you do that until you read the entirety of, and you might not do it until you get to J. I mean, you won't have that problem because you'll get to B and you'll read them out. And you'll say, oh, I'm gonna read these books, baby. But this is how I found the poet A. Van Jordan, his first book, Rise. I remember reading that first poem and getting through it and thinking, well, I got through the first poem, so that means I'm gonna read this book. And then I read the book. Do you understand what I mean? So you want some, and you can do that anytime, any place. I don't care who's around. No. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, you can read, you can do that. And then the other thing that's, I think, important about this is that you read looking, you know, you might like a book or think you like a book because of its subject matter. The subject can have something to do with your interest, but it's important for everybody in here to know the fact that that it is really easy to write bad poems about kittens. And it is possible to write a good poem about kittens, which tells you subject matter has nothing to do with whether or not your poem is doing what a poem ought to do. Ultimately, the reason why you fall in love with a poem is because of the way it was written. And so you have to figure out the way it was written, which means you look at the poem for strategies. What are strategies? Sometimes a strategy in a poet like Sharon Olds, the strategy is a list of metaphors, and I mean, you know, it's kind of bad if it's the same strategy every time, or maybe very good if it's the same strategy every time. You know, some people say that's formulaic, but you know, they don't know it's formulaic until you do it again in a second book, so I wouldn't worry about it. You ain't wrote the first one, do you know what I mean? List of metaphors, then an abstraction at the end, and then you can go do that. You can go right now, look at a single item, make a list of metaphors about that item of about a page, and then at the end, say something so big and abstract that those metaphors matter in a new way. Does that make sense? Or in Claudia Rankine, it might be a strategy to be in the mind thinking about an occurrence, and then suddenly find out that the speaker who you thought was only thinking about that occurrence is having a conversation with somebody who participated in the occurrence in that moment. That's a strategy. Do you understand what I mean? Opening a poem with a concrete scene is a strategy. Making a list in the middle of a poem is a strategy. And once you know the strategies, once you know the reason why you got excited, metaphorizing by way of putting something concrete inside something abstract, which I try to tell my students not to do so much of. It's their favorite strategy. You know, they love to put their foot in love. Do you know the sitting at the foot of my anger is the kind of things my students like to say, which starts to get on my nerves. But I mean, it is a strategy. It's just like, girl, do it once. Do you understand what I'm saying? So you want to read poems for strategy, and then once you know strategies, they're in your head. It's good if you write them down. That way they're really in your head, but you don't have to write them down. They sort of come by way of osmosis or by way of reading itself. And then when you go to write, you understand you're making decisions. You're not just writing what happened. You're deciding, I'm going to use a strategy to say the next thing that needs to be said. And that is how I would tell anybody. But that means you got to read forever on your own, which is harder to do if you're not in school. When you have an assignment, you feel like, I don't want to fail this class. But if you don't have an assignment, you have to understand that it's for you, which means you have to be important to yourself.
Yes.
And if you're not important, and it's real life for artists and for writers and for poets in particular, when it's time to pick our kids up, we're generally on time. When it's time to show up at the dentist's office, we're generally on time. When our time is involved with somebody else's time, we can be there. We generally do what we're supposed to do on time at the time we're supposed to do it. But if we set a time to write, suddenly we are not important enough to meet ourselves for the time to write. So that's all the reading stuff. The next thing is daily writing, to have a time of the day. I think it's a good idea to do the morning. You're a young person, so you're gonna think you can do it at night. The only thing about doing it at night is you don't end up doing it because you go to sleep instead, but you're grown. Find a time that no matter what, every day at 12 o'clock, I write. Now, what is writing? Writing does not mean you have to make a new poem. As a matter of fact, if you're doing journaling and you actually do it with your hand, you have written. but you've gotta have a time of day, and I would say you start. Even if you're working on poems that are in their early forms, right? Like you're on the third draft. If you can work on the third draft of a poem for 10 minutes in a day, then you have written that day. But some days you don't want to be working on a draft. Some days you want to be doing something new. So I would start with just 10 minutes, and every 4 weeks try to expand that 10 minutes. And when I say expand, I mean 11, and then 12, and then 13. There will be a leap that's made somewhere, and suddenly you will find that you write every day for an hour, or you write every day for 2 hours. You'll find that happens to you. Just,
Yeah.
I write every day for 2 hours, unless I'm on the road, in which case maybe sometimes I'm at 10 minutes, sometimes I'm at 30, whatever. But I try to write every day. If I'm on the road, I can't do it at the exact same time that I would do it at home. It's what I like about summer. And in summertime, it's my time, girl. And so I can every day know I'm gonna wake up and I'm gonna write at a certain time. Do you know, I know I'm gonna write for 2 hours because I eat first. And I'm usually hungry in 2 hours. Is that answer?
Yeah,
That's my
okay.
advice. Yeah, sorry. I answered that for a long time. Sorry.
That's awesome.
We are at
At 3:02.
we're at 3:02.
And I only answered 2 questions.
Perfect. But amazing discussion. I love the fact that you brought it to theoretical part, you brought it to practical parts, what it means to be a writer.
Yeah.
I think that's really useful and for people to hear. I love your discussion of the library, which is my
Yes.
way to remind you tonight. What's her name? McKinney?
Laura McKinney.
Laura McKinney is going to get her shout out at the reading
Yeah,
at the
she
South
probably will.
Bend Public Library.
And those people are putting their bodies on the line in this community at the library.
Oh, good. I like
yeah,
that.
we're gonna go do it there.
So, yeah, feel free to mull around, but yeah, everybody, thank you.